At 3:47 a.m. on December 18, 1944, Corporal Teodoro Teddy Baltazar, a 26-year-old supply clerk with the Philippine Commonwealth Army's 66th Infantry Regiment, crouched in a muddy foxhole 300 yards from the eastern perimeter of San Jose Village in Nueva Ecija Province, watching through rain-soaked darkness as approximately 200 Japanese soldiers from the Imperial Army's 105th Division advanced in staggered columns across the flooded rice paddies. Gripped in his calloused hands was a 6-foot length of Kawayan tinic bamboo, hollowed and carved into the crude shape of a tuba, a traditional brass instrument, with a bell end fashioned from salvaged tin sheeting and a mouthpiece wrapped in rubber strips cut from a destroyed American Jeep tire. In on his own reinforcements, what remained of Captain Eugenio Valdez's undermanned company were dug in nearly 800 yards behind him across the Talavera River, too distant to provide covering fire without risking hitting their own forward positions. In approximately 4 minutes, if Baltazar's calculations were correct based on the enemy's current pace and the terrain conditions, the Japanese reconnaissance element would reach the concealed tripwires connected to the guerrillas' last 3 functioning grenades, triggering a firefight that would expose the Filipinos' true defensive weakness and numerically inferior position. Yes, but what military historians would later struggle to explain in their classified debriefings was not the tactical disadvantage or the desperate circumstances. It was how a former municipal band member, armed with nothing but a hollow piece of bamboo and an intimate understanding of acoustic warfare, managed to achieve what mortars, machine guns, and artillery had repeatedly failed to accomplish: the complete psychological disintegration of an advancing enemy force through sound alone. Teodoro Baltazar had never wanted to be remarkable. Before the war consumed the Philippines in fire and occupation, he had been perfectly content as the third tuba player in the San Jose Municipal Band, performing at fiestas, weddings, and the occasional provincial celebration. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, jaw with a wiry build and permanently dirt-stained fingernails from his family's small farm, Teddy possessed neither the commanding presence nor the formal military bearing that typically defined combat soldiers. When the Commonwealth Army had absorbed local guerrilla units in late 1943, he'd been assigned to supply management, inventorying ammunition, distributing rations, and maintaining equipment manifests for the 66th Infantry Regiment's Bravo Company. His rank of corporal was less a reflection of leadership capability and more an administrative necessity. Someone needed to track the dwindling supplies, and Baltazar could read, write, and maintain meticulous records despite having only completed primary school education. The officers appreciated his efficiency. His fellow soldiers generally ignored him, and in the brutal calculus of guerrilla warfare against a technologically superior enemy, supply clerks ranked somewhere between latrine diggers and radio operators in terms of tactical relevance. Baltazar counts bullets, Staff Sergeant Ramon Mercado once remarked during a poker game in the company's temporary headquarters, a half-collapsed Bahay Kubo on the outskirts of San Jose. He doesn't shoot them. The comment generated laughter from the assembled enlisted men, none of it malicious, all of it dismissive. Teddy had been sitting in the corner, updating inventory logs by candlelight, and he'd smiled along with the joke because that was easier than explaining what he'd been observing for the past 3 months. The truth was, Teodoro Baltazar had been conducting an unauthorized experiment in acoustic warfare, and almost no one knew about it. It had started in September 1944, during a particularly vicious Japanese sweep through the villages northwest of Cabanatuan. Baltazar had been positioned with a rear-guard element, tasked with monitoring supplies while the combat elements engaged the enemy. From his concealed position, nearly half a mile from the fighting, he'd heard something unusual. Not the distinctive crack of rifle fire or the thunder of grenades, but a deep, resonant boom that seemed to travel through the ground itself before reaching his ears through the humid air. The sound had been produced by a Japanese Type 89 grenade discharger, what American forces called a knee mortar. But what fascinated Baltazar wasn't the weapon itself. It was the way the sound propagated across the flooded rice paddies, amplified and distorted by the water, the vegetation, and the peculiar topography of Nueva Ecija's agricultural landscape. The sound had reached him seconds before he had seen the actual explosion, and in those seconds Baltazar had experienced something close to paralyzing fear. Not because the weapon was nearby, it wasn't, but because the sound had been transformed into something alien and directionally ambiguous, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. For a man who had spent 15 years understanding how brass instruments manipulated air pressure to create sound, this was revelation. Over the following weeks, whenever the company had rare moments of relative safety, Baltazar began experimenting. He started with a simple length of bamboo, testing how different bore diameters, lengths, and bell shapes affected sound propagation. And he tested his instruments at dawn and dusk when temperature inversions were most pronounced. He tested them across water, through jungle vegetation, and in the open air of harvested rice fields. The results were consistent and remarkable. Properly constructed bamboo instruments could produce low-frequency sounds that traveled exceptional distances with minimal energy expenditure, and when deployed in specific environmental conditions, those sounds became psychologically disorienting to listeners who couldn't identify the source. Baltazar had attempted to explain his findings to Captain Valdez on October 3rd during a routine supply briefing. "Sir, I believe I have identified a potential tactical application for acoustic deception," Baltazar had begun, standing at attention in the captain's makeshift office. Valdez, and a former Philippine Scouts officer with actual military academy training, had looked up from his maps with an expression of polite incredulity. "Acoustic deception, Corporal?" "Yes, sir. Using bamboo instruments to simulate artillery or aircraft sounds at distance, potentially disrupting enemy formations or masking our actual positions." The captain had studied Baltazar for a long moment, then returned his attention to the maps. "Corporal, our tactical priorities currently involve ammunition conservation, medical supplies, and maintaining communication with other resistance elements. I need you focused on supply management, not—" He'd paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. "Musical experimentation." "Understood, sir." "Dismissed." The conversation had lasted 90 seconds. Baltazar had saluted, returned to his duties, and continued his experiments anyway, but with greater discretion. The problem wasn't that Captain Valdez was a bad officer. He was competent, dedicated, and genuinely concerned about his men's welfare. The problem was doctrinal. Acoustic deception was not part of established guerrilla warfare methodology. There were no field manuals addressing it, no precedents in Philippine military history, no expert validation. And Teodoro Baltazar, despite his meticulous observations and careful experimentation, was still just a supply clerk with a municipal band background. His lack of formal military education, tactical training, or combat experience made his claims easy to discount. Officers made tactical decisions based on doctrine, training, and established practice. A corporal's hobby project, no matter how enthusiastically presented, could not compete with institutional knowledge. Staff Sergeant Mercado had been more direct when Baltazar had attempted to demonstrate a bamboo instrument to several enlisted men in late October. "Teddy, with respect, we're fighting the Japanese Imperial Army, not performing at a fucking fiesta," Mercado had said, not unkindly. "You want to help? Make sure we have ammunition when we need it." The other soldiers had nodded agreement. These were men who had survived ambushes, endured strafing runs, and watched friends die in muddy foxholes. The suggestion that bamboo tubes might have tactical value seemed, at best, charmingly naive. Baltazar had packed away his instruments and returned to his official duties. But he hadn't stopped observing. By December 1944, the strategic situation in Nueva Ecija province had deteriorated into a grinding war of attrition that heavily favored the Japanese occupiers. The 66th Infantry Regiment, like most Philippine Commonwealth Army units operating in central Luzon, existed in a state of permanent numerical and material disadvantage. Captain Valdez's Bravo Company had started the year with approximately 200 effectives. Combat losses, disease, and desertion had reduced that number to 73 soldiers, many operating with outdated rifles, insufficient ammunition, and minimal medical support. The Japanese 105th Division, by contrast, maintained robust supply lines, superior firepower, and systematic tactical doctrine. Their sweep operations through Nueva Ecija followed predictable patterns: concentrated force projection, overwhelming firepower at contact points, and methodical, village-by-village pacification. The strategy was brutal, effective, and backed by resources the Philippine resistance simply could not match. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were preparing a major offensive aimed at eliminating resistance elements in the San Jose Talavera corridor before American forces could establish a foothold for the anticipated Philippines Liberation Campaign. The reports were accurate. What they couldn't predict was the timeline or the specific units involved. For Captain Valdez and his diminished company, the tactical calculus was straightforward and grim. They could not win a direct engagement against a numerically superior, better equipped enemy force. Their only advantages were terrain knowledge, local population support, and in the ability to avoid decisive combat through mobility and deception. Standard guerrilla doctrine emphasized harassment, disruption of supply lines, intelligence gathering, and survival. Direct confrontation was to be avoided, except under circumstances that heavily favored the resistance: ambushes against isolated patrols, nighttime raids, sabotage operations with clear escape routes. The problem was that the Japanese 105th Division had adapted their tactics specifically to counter guerrilla warfare methodology. They had begun using night vision-equipped reconnaissance elements, maintaining unpredictable patrol schedules, and deploying rapid response units that could reinforce contact points within minutes. More significantly, they had adopted a policy of disproportionate retaliation. Any guerrilla attack resulted in systematic punishment of nearby civilian populations. Villages suspected of supporting resistance forces were burned. Inhabitants were either executed or relocated to fortified zones under direct Japanese control. This created an impossible dilemma for units like Bravo Company. Every tactical success came with potential civilian cost. Every engagement risked reprisals against the very people the Commonwealth Army was supposed to protect. Captain Valdez spent December agonizing over these calculations. On December 10th, during a command conference with other resistance leaders in the area, he'd laid out the situation with characteristic bluntness. We cannot match them in firepower. We cannot match them in numbers. We cannot protect the civilian population through conventional military means. Our current strategy is survival, intelligence gathering, and waiting for American liberation forces. Any alternative suggestions are welcome. Lieutenant Antonio Reyes, commanding what remained of the regiment's Charlie Company, had proposed a fighting withdrawal deeper into the Sierra Madre foothills, abandoning the lowland villages to Japanese control until American forces arrived. The proposal was strategically sound and morally devastating. Abandoning the villages meant abandoning thousands of civilians to Japanese occupation brutality. It meant allowing the enemy to consolidate control over the region's agricultural resources. It meant ceding territory that might prove strategically valuable when American forces eventually arrived. And it also meant survival for the resistance fighters. Valdez had tabled the proposal, promising a decision within 1 week. That decision became irrelevant on December 17th, when reconnaissance elements reported a Japanese battalion-strength force moving toward San Jose with heavy equipment support, mortars, machine guns, and at least 2 Type 95 light tanks. The Japanese weren't planning another sweep operation. They were planning annihilation. The reconnaissance report reached Bravo Company's headquarters at 4:30 p.m. on December 17th, delivered by a breathless runner from one of the local intelligence networks. Captain Valdez had read the report 3 times, then sent for his senior NCOs. Japanese battalion, approximately 400 effectives, moving southeast along the Talavera Road. Estimated arrival San Jose vicinity within 18 hours. Heavy weapons support confirmed. Intention appears to be establishment of fortified position, controlling the San Jose-Cabanatuan Junction. Staff Sergeant Mercado had studied the hastily drawn map, then looked at Valdez with naked concern. Sir, we can't engage that force. Not directly. Not with 73 men. Agreed. Recommend immediate withdrawal to secondary positions across the river. Also agreed. Begin preparations immediately. I want the company across the Talavera River by 0200 hours tomorrow. Establish defensive positions on the western bank. Demolish the main bridge to slow their advance. What about the civilians still in San Jose? Valdez had been silent for several seconds. They'll have to evacuate on their own initiative. We cannot protect them. The order was militarily sound and personally agonizing for everyone present. Bravo Company spent the next several hours in organized chaos, packing essential supplies, destroying what couldn't be carried, preparing demolition charges for the bridge, and sending runners to warn the civilian population. Teodoro Baltazar had been inventorying ammunition when Corporal Miguel Santos approached him with unusual urgency. Teddy, you still have those bamboo things you were making? Baltazar looked up from his counting. The instruments, yes. Why? The captain's looking for options. Any option. Someone mentioned your acoustic idea. This was unexpected. Baltazar had assumed his experiments had been completely dismissed. Well, what kind of options? Anything that might slow the Japanese advance or make them cautious about pushing into San Jose. The captain knows we can't fight them directly, but if we can buy time for civilian evacuation or make them commit to a slower, more careful approach. Baltazar's mind raced through tactical applications. I'd need to know the specific terrain where we want to affect their movement. Rice paddies east of San Jose, flooded fields, approximately 300 yards of open ground before they reach the village perimeter. Weather forecast? Rain likely, heavy cloud cover temperature dropping after midnight. Baltazar felt something click into place in his understanding. That's perfect. The atmospheric conditions will enhance low-frequency sound propagation. And if I position instruments at specific intervals and coordinate the acoustic output, I can create directional ambiguity and simulate artillery or aircraft sounds at distance. Santos looked skeptical. You're sure about this? I've been testing it for 3 months. The physics work. The question is whether it works under combat conditions with enemy forces who've been trained to identify actual threat sounds. The captain wants to talk to you. Now. Captain Valdez's headquarters had been reduced to a single room in an abandoned schoolhouse, lit by 2 kerosene lamps and smelling of damp paper and gun oil. When Baltazar entered, saluted, and stood at attention, the captain was studying maps with Staff Sergeant Mercado and Lieutenant Fernando Cruz, the company's executive officer. Corporal Baltazar, and I understand you've been conducting experiments with bamboo instruments for tactical applications. Yes, sir. Explain. Baltazar had spent 3 months refining his pitch, but he'd never expected to deliver it under these circumstances. He kept his explanation technical and focused. Sir, low-frequency sounds travel exceptional distances through humid air and across water with minimal energy loss. Traditional brass instruments like tubas produce frequencies between 40 and 350 hertz, which propagate efficiently in tropical environments. By constructing bamboo instruments with specific bore characteristics and bell designs, I can replicate those frequencies and create sounds that are directionally ambiguous to listeners, meaning the source location is difficult to pinpoint. Valdez listened without interruption. Yet in flooded rice paddies, the acoustic conditions are optimal. Sound waves bounce off water surfaces. Vegetation creates diffusion patterns, and temperature inversions, especially common in early morning hours, can create acoustic ducting effects that project sounds far beyond their apparent source. If I position multiple instruments at calculated intervals and coordinate their output, I can create the auditory impression of artillery fire, aircraft engines, or large-scale troop movements occurring at distances and directions that don't match reality. To what purpose? Psychological disruption, sir. Enemy forces trained to respond to specific threat indicators will react to sounds they recognize as dangerous. Artillery, aircraft, armor. If those sounds seem to come from unexpected directions, or if the acoustic environment makes threat assessment difficult, it creates hesitation and tactical caution. Lieutenant Cruz spoke up. You're proposing we try to scare the Japanese with fake sounds? No, sir. I'm proposing we exploit their training and threat recognition protocols to induce tactical uncertainty. It's not about fear. It's about making them question their situational awareness and respond to phantom threats. Staff Sergeant Mercado crossed his arms. Teddy, with all due respect, these are experienced Japanese soldiers. They've been fighting for years. You think some bamboo horns are going to make them forget their training? I think, Sergeant, that human auditory perception is remarkably unreliable under stress, and that even experienced soldiers make tactical decisions based on incomplete sensory information. So if I can introduce enough acoustic confusion during their approach, it might cause them to slow their advance, deploy into defensive formations, or commit resources to investigating phantom threats. Every minute of delay is valuable. Valdez studied Baltazar with renewed attention. You've tested this under actual combat conditions? No, sir. I've tested the acoustic principles and sound propagation characteristics. I haven't tested psychological impact on enemy forces. So you're guessing. I'm making informed predictions based on consistent experimental results and established acoustic physics, sir. The room fell silent. Outside, rain had begun falling, a steady tropical downpour that drummed against the schoolhouse's corrugated roof. Captain Valdez finally spoke. Yet our tactical situation is this. We cannot defend San Jose against a battalion-strength enemy force. We're withdrawing across the river and establishing fallback positions. The main bridge will be destroyed at 1:30 hours. The Japanese will reach San Jose by midday tomorrow, and will likely establish a fortified position controlling the junction. Our goal is to delay their advance long enough for remaining civilians to evacuate. He pointed to the map. There's a 300-yard stretch of flooded rice paddies on the eastern approach to San Jose. It's the most direct route for their advance. Standard doctrine would have us plant mines or establish a sacrificial rear guard to slow them down. We have 4 functioning mines and cannot afford to lose personnel in a delaying action. Valdez looked directly at Baltazar. And I'm authorizing you to position your instruments in that area and attempt your acoustic deception operation. You'll work alone. I cannot spare personnel for what remains an experimental approach. You'll have until 0100 hours to get into position. Your objective is to delay enemy advance by any means possible without engaging directly. If you can buy us 30 minutes of additional evacuation time, the operation is successful. Understood, sir. Corporal, I'm authorizing this because we have no better options, not because I'm confident in your approach. If this fails, you withdraw immediately and rejoin the company across the river. No heroics, no last stands. Clear? Crystal clear, sir. Dismissed. Get your equipment ready. Baltazar saluted and left the room, his heart hammering, but his mind already calculating positioning, timing, and an acoustic trajectories. Behind him, he heard Lieutenant Cruz mutter, "We're sending a supply clerk with a bamboo horn to delay a Japanese battalion. We're completely fucked." Staff Sergeant Mercado's reply was quieter. "We've been fucked since December 7th, 1941, sir. At least this way, we're trying something different." Teodoro Baltazar spent the next 4 hours in frantic preparation that felt simultaneously like vindication and suicide mission. His instruments had been stored in a makeshift workshop, a covered area behind the supply depot constructed from salvaged lumber and canvas tarps. He'd built 7 functional instruments over the past 3 months, each designed for specific acoustic applications. The primary instrument, was the one he'd nicknamed Big Thunder, was a 6-foot length of Kawayan tinic bamboo with a 4-inch bore diameter. The bell end had been fashioned from tin sheeting salvaged from a destroyed Japanese supply truck, and the mouthpiece was wrapped in rubber strips for proper lip seal and moisture resistance. When properly blown, it produced a fundamental frequency around 65 Hz, roughly the same as a genuine tuba's lowest register, with powerful harmonic overtones that could travel over a mile in optimal conditions. The second and third instruments, Echo 1 and Echo 2, were shorter, 4 feet each, with narrower bore diameters that produced mid-range frequencies around 120 Hz. These were designed for rapid sequential firing to create the impression of multiple artillery pieces or synchronized weapons systems. Yet the remaining 4 instruments were experimental designs Baltazar had been refining. 2 that produced distinctive whistling overtones meant to simulate incoming artillery shells, and 2 that created rumbling percussive sounds that might be mistaken for distant explosions or armor movement. None of them looked like military equipment. They looked like crude folk instruments, cobbled together by someone with more enthusiasm than skill. But Baltazar knew what military observers couldn't see: the thousands of subtle design choices embedded in bore angles, bell shapes, and resonance characteristics. Each instrument represented months of experimentation, failure, and refinement. He spent 90 minutes waterproofing the instruments with rubber sheeting and ensuring the mouthpieces would remain functional in heavy rain. Then he prepared carrying straps from salvaged canvas. He packed a small toolkit for field repairs, bamboo splits, rubber adhesive, wire for emergency bell reattachment. At 8:45 p.m., Corporal Santos appeared with a rifle, ammunition, and rations. "Captain says you need basic combat equipment." Baltazar accepted the rifle, an old Enfield, with mixed feelings. He was proficient with rifles from basic training, but carrying one meant weight and encumbrance he'd rather avoid. "Tell the captain I appreciate it." Santos watched Baltazar secure the instruments into a carrying frame. "Teddy, you really think this'll work?" "I think it's possible. That's all I've got." "Most of the company thinks you're crazy. What do you think?" Santos considered the question seriously. "Jen, I think you're the only person in this unit who's been trying to solve problems instead of just surviving them. That counts for something." They shook hands. Santos departed to help with bridge demolition preparations. At 10:15 p.m., Baltazar conducted a final equipment check. 7 instruments, properly secured and waterproofed. Rifle and 40 rounds of ammunition. 2 canteens of water. 3 days of rations. Compass, map, and watch. A notebook containing his acoustic calculations and positioning coordinates. He reported to Captain Valdez at 10:30 p.m. "Corporal, you're clear to move out. Remember your orders. Delay. Don't engage. If the situation becomes untenable, withdraw immediately." "Yes, sir." "Good luck." Baltazar saluted, hoisted his equipment, and disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness. Just the journey to the eastern rice paddies took 90 minutes of careful navigation through abandoned villages, flooded fields, and jungle vegetation. Baltazar moved slowly, stopping frequently to check his compass bearing and ensure he wasn't being observed by Japanese scouts or local civilians who might inadvertently reveal his position. The rain was both blessing and curse. It provided concealment and would enhance sound propagation, but it also made movement exhausting and increased the risk of equipment damage. He reached his primary position at 12:47 a.m., a slight elevation on the western edge of the flooded rice paddies, approximately 300 yards from where Japanese forces would likely enter the open ground. The position offered good sight lines, minimal cover, and exactly the acoustic characteristics he needed. Baltazar immediately began positioning his instruments according to the plan he'd rehearsed mentally for 3 months. Big Thunder was positioned at the center point, elevated on a small earthen mound that would project sound across the water. Echo 1 and Echo 2 were placed 80 yards apart on flanking positions, creating triangulated sound sources that would make directional identification difficult. The experimental instruments were scattered at irregular intervals, designed to create secondary acoustic confusion. Each instrument was secured with stakes and guy wires to prevent wind displacement. Each was positioned at specific angles, calculated to maximize sound projection while minimizing source detection. The setup took 43 minutes. At 1:45 a.m., and Baltazar hunkered into his foul, a shallow depression he'd improved with hastily piled mud, and waited. The rain continued steadily. Behind him, across the Talavera River, he heard a distant explosion as Bravo Company demolished the main bridge. Scattered gunfire echoed from the village as rear guard elements engaged Japanese scouts. The sound of war was moving closer. At 2:15 a.m., Baltazar heard engines, distant but unmistakable. Trucks or light armor, moving along the Talavera Road. The Japanese advance was ahead of schedule. At 2:53 a.m., he saw movement at the eastern tree line. Dark shapes, moving with tactical discipline, spreading into assault formation. The enemy had arrived. Baltazar checked his watch, controlled his breathing, and prepared to execute the most unconventional military operation in Philippine resistance history. Some at 3:12 a.m., the Japanese reconnaissance element began their approach across the flooded rice paddies. Baltazar counted approximately 40 soldiers, a reinforced platoon, moving in staggered columns with proper tactical spacing. They were professionals, advancing with weapons ready, maintaining sight lines and mutual support. Behind them, at the tree line, he could see larger formations preparing to follow once the reconnaissance element declared the approach secure. Standard doctrine. Predictable. Exactly what he'd hoped for. Baltazar waited until the lead elements were approximately 150 yards into the open ground, far enough from cover to be committed, close enough for psychological impact. He lifted Big Thunder to his lips, sealed the mouthpiece against his face, and blew with controlled force. And the sound that emerged was profound, visceral, and absolutely shocking in its power. The fundamental frequency resonated at 65 Hz, below the threshold of clear pitch perception, but powerful enough to be felt as much as heard. The harmonic overtones created a complex acoustic signature that, in the rain-soaked environment, transformed into something alien and directionally ambiguous. To the Japanese soldiers advancing across the paddies, it sounded like distant artillery, but artillery that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, echoing off water and vegetation in ways that made threat assessment nearly impossible. The lead reconnaissance element immediately dropped into defensive positions, weapons raised, scanning for targets. Baltazar immediately transitioned to Echo 1, positioned 80 yards to his left. And he triggered a rapid burst, 3 sharp blasts in quick succession, each producing mid-range frequencies that propagated differently than Big Thunder's low tones. The effect was calculated chaos. The 2 distinct sound sources, producing different frequencies from different locations, created the acoustic impression of multiple weapons systems operating in coordinated fashion. At the tree line, the larger Japanese formation halted their advance. Baltazar could see officers shouting orders, soldiers pointing in conflicting directions, attempting to identify threat sources that didn't actually exist. He triggered Echo 2 from the right flank. Another rapid burst, slightly different frequency profile. Then back to Big Thunder for a sustained low-frequency blast that seemed to shake the very air. The Japanese reconnaissance element withdrew 15 yards, establishing a more defensive posture. Baltazar was now operating in a state of controlled fury, moving between instruments with practiced efficiency, triggering calculated acoustic sequences designed to create maximum psychological impact. He used the experimental whistling instruments to simulate incoming artillery shells, producing rising frequency tones that mimicked the Doppler effect of descending ordnance. He used the rumbling instruments to suggest armor movement behind their lines. He coordinated Big Thunder with rapid echo bursts to create the impression of artillery batteries preparing to fire. Every sound was false. Every threat was phantom. And yet the Japanese formation responded exactly as trained, establishing defensive positions, calling for fire support, and attempting to identify enemy artillery positions. At 3:28 a.m., Baltazar saw what he'd been hoping for, bollard signal flares rising from the tree line. The Japanese were requesting artillery support of their own, believing they'd encountered fortified positions with significant firepower. The irony was beautiful. They were calling for real artillery to suppress imaginary artillery. At 3:35 a.m., Japanese mortar rounds began falling on positions approximately 200 yards behind Baltazar's actual location. suppressing fire aimed at where their acoustic analysis suggested Filipino artillery must be positioned. The mortars were hitting empty ground, wasting ammunition on phantom threats. Baltazar kept playing. His lips were numb from the rubber mouthpiece, his lungs burned from sustained controlled breathing, and his hands were cramping from manipulating the instruments in rapid sequence. But he kept playing, because it was working. At 3:47 a.m., the moment captured at this story's beginning, Baltazar was in his foxhole, soaked with rain and sweat, watching the Japanese formation remain essentially frozen, in defensive posture, nearly 300 yards from the village perimeter. They had been stalled for 35 minutes. He'd exceeded the mission objective. And then something unexpected happened. A Japanese officer, Baltazar could see the distinctive rank insignia, even at distance, began moving forward through the defensive formation, clearly attempting to restore forward momentum. Baltazar made a split-second tactical decision. He grabbed Big Thunder, positioned himself at maximum elevation, and blew the most powerful sustained blast he'd yet produced, pouring every ounce of air from his lungs into the instrument, creating a low-frequency roar that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The sound was so powerful that even Baltazar felt it vibrating in his chest cavity. Across the paddies, every Japanese soldier dropped flat. The officer dove for cover, and in that moment, Teodoro Baltazar understood something profound. Fear wasn't about actual threat. It was about uncertainty. These were experienced soldiers who'd survived countless engagements. They weren't afraid of combat. They were afraid of fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't locate, and couldn't understand. At 4:02 a.m., the Japanese formation began a tactical withdrawal back to the tree line. They were retreating from bamboo instruments. Baltazar remained in position until 4:45 a.m., occasionally triggering acoustic bursts to maintain the psychological pressure. By 5:15 a.m., full daylight was beginning to break through the rain clouds, and maintaining the deception became increasingly risky. With visibility improving, the Japanese would eventually identify his actual position and neutralize what they'd believed was a significant defensive emplacement. Baltazar executed his withdrawal plan, collapsing the instruments, securing essential equipment, and moving westward through the paddies using a covered route he'd pre-scouted. The journey back to Bravo Company's defensive positions took 2 hours of exhausting movement through flooded terrain. He reached the western bank of the Talavera River at 7:23 a.m., exhausted, soaked, and barely able to stand. And Staff Sergeant Mercado spotted him first. Holy shit, Teddy's alive. Within minutes, Baltazar was surrounded by soldiers demanding to know what had happened. The Japanese formation stalled out around 03:15 hours, Baltazar reported, struggling to maintain military formality. They maintained defensive posture until approximately 0400, then withdrew to tree-line positions. They burned through significant mortar ammunition, engaging phantom positions. Best estimate, we bought 90 minutes of delay. Captain Valdez arrived, looking both relieved and bewildered. Corporal, we heard the sounds from here. We thought you'd somehow called in artillery support we didn't have. No, sir. Just the instruments. You're telling me you stalled a Japanese reconnaissance element for 90 minutes using bamboo horns? Yes. Yeah. Sir, that's... Valdez paused, clearly struggling with the military implications. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, and apparently it worked. The story spread through Bravo Company within hours. By evening, it had reached other resistance units. By the end of the week, it had become legend, embellished, exaggerated, and fundamentally true. The Japanese 105th Division did eventually push into San Jose, but their advance was cautious, methodical, and 12 hours behind schedule. That delay allowed hundreds of civilians to evacuate and enabled Bravo Company to establish more secure defensive positions. More significantly, the Japanese had committed resources to counter a threat that didn't exist. They'd wasted ammunition, expended energy, and most importantly, how they'd been made uncertain about their operational intelligence. On December 22nd, Captain Valdez formally recognized Baltazar's actions in his after-action report. Corporal Teodoro Baltazar executed an unauthorized acoustic deception operation that achieved delay objectives exceeding mission parameters. While unconventional and lacking doctrinal precedent, his actions demonstrated tactical innovation and courage. Recommend formal commendation. The commendation never came. Bureaucratic realities of guerrilla warfare made formal recognition impossible. But something more valuable emerged: respect. Staff Sergeant Mercado approached Baltazar on December 24th, Christmas Eve, as the company prepared defensive positions against another expected Japanese probe. "Teddy, I owe you an apology. And I thought you were wasting time with those bamboo things. Turns out you were solving problems the rest of us didn't understand existed. You were right to be skeptical, Sergeant. It was experimental." "Yeah, but you did the experiment. You tested it. You proved it worked. That's not being crazy. That's being a soldier who thinks instead of just following orders." Other soldiers approached with similar sentiments. The mockery was gone. The dismissiveness had evaporated. Teodoro Baltazar, supply clerk and municipal band member, had become someone whose ideas deserved consideration. Over the following months, as American liberation forces gradually pushed through the Philippines, Baltazar's acoustic deception techniques evolved from experimental curiosity to recognized tactical methodology. Captain Valdez authorized the formation of a specialized four-man acoustic deception unit, with Baltazar training 3 other soldiers in instrument construction and deployment tactics. The unit operated as force multipliers, making small guerrilla formations appear larger, creating phantom threats to divert enemy attention, and exploiting the Japanese military's reliance on auditory threat assessment. On January 15, 1945, during an operation near Bongabon, Baltazar's unit successfully simulated an American armor column, causing a Japanese supply convoy to abandon their vehicles and flee into the jungle. The guerrillas captured 3 trucks fully loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and food rations, all without firing a single shot. And the operation's after-action analysis revealed something remarkable. The Japanese had reported encountering mechanized American forces supported by artillery, when in reality they'd faced 4 Filipino soldiers with bamboo instruments positioned on elevated terrain. By February, other resistance units were requesting acoustic deception support. Baltazar found himself training guerrillas from different provinces, sharing his techniques and improvised instrument designs. The methodology spread through the Philippine resistance network, adapted and refined by operators who added their own innovations. A former teacher from Pangasinan developed instruments that could simulate aircraft engine sounds, the distinctive drone of American bombers that Japanese forces had learned to fear. These were deployed during nighttime operations to suggest imminent air raids, causing Japanese positions to activate searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries, revealing their locations for actual guerrilla attacks. A fisherman from Bataan created underwater resonance chambers, sealed bamboo instruments that could be triggered remotely to create sounds that propagated through rivers and coastlines, simulating submarine activity and disrupting Japanese naval patrol patterns. The innovations multiplied as creative problem solvers recognized that acoustic warfare wasn't about sophisticated technology. It was about understanding how human perception, environmental conditions, and enemy training protocols could be exploited. But Baltazar himself maintained careful humility about his techniques. During a February training session with newly arrived American liaison officers, a Lieutenant Harrison from U.S. Army Intelligence had questioned the tactical value of acoustic deception. "Corporal, these techniques might work against confused or poorly trained troops, but experienced Japanese soldiers will eventually recognize they're being fooled." Baltazar had nodded respectfully. "You're absolutely correct, sir. These techniques have limited effectiveness against static defensive positions where enemy forces have time to conduct thorough reconnaissance. They are most effective during movement operations at night or in environments where visual confirmation is difficult. The goal isn't to permanently deceive. It's to create temporary tactical uncertainty that provides exploitable advantage." "And you accept these limitations?" "Sir, so we're guerrillas fighting an enemy with superior firepower, better logistics, and more training. Every technique we employ has limitations. The question isn't whether acoustic deception is perfect. It's whether it's more effective than alternatives given our resource constraints." Lieutenant Harrison had included Baltazar's techniques in his intelligence report to MacArthur's headquarters, noting, "Indigenous forces have developed creative acoustic warfare methods that demonstrate tactical innovation despite material limitations. Recommend evaluation for broader application." The recommendation generated academic interest, but no formal adoption. The U.S. military had acoustic warfare specialists, established doctrine, and sophisticated equipment. Bamboo instruments built by guerrillas didn't fit organizational frameworks designed around industrial warfare. But for the Philippine resistance, those bamboo instruments represented something more valuable than official recognition. Proof that intelligence, observation, and willingness to experiment could overcome material disadvantage. What Baltazar and other Filipino guerrillas couldn't know at the time was how profoundly his acoustic deception had impacted Japanese operational planning. Captured Japanese documents, examined after the war, revealed that the 105th Division had significantly revised their tactical assessments of resistance capabilities following the December 18th incident near San Jose. A report filed by Major Takeshi Yamamoto, intelligence officer for the division, stated, "Enemy forces demonstrate unexpected artillery capabilities and coordination, suggesting American material support has reached higher levels than previously estimated. Recommend increased caution during approach operations and enhanced reconnaissance protocols." The report was based entirely on acoustic signatures, sounds that had seemed authentic enough to convince experienced officers that Filipino guerrillas had acquired American artillery support. More significantly, the Japanese began allocating resources to counter threats that didn't exist. Artillery units were repositioned. Mortar ammunition was expended suppressing phantom positions. Reconnaissance protocols were lengthened, slowing operational tempo. And every resource diverted to counter Baltazar's acoustic deception was a resource not employed against actual resistance positions. The psychological impact extended beyond tactical miscalculation. Japanese soldiers began reporting ghost artillery that fired without visual confirmation, created unpredictable acoustic signatures, and seemed to operate in ways that violated their understanding of conventional warfare. This wasn't superstition. It was rational confusion caused by sensory information that didn't match training or experience. A diary entry from a Japanese corporal captured in February 1945 recorded, "The Filipino guerrillas have weapons we cannot see. They fire from positions that should not exist. The jungle itself seems to attack us, yet I no longer trust what I hear." This erosion of confidence in sensory perception was precisely what Baltazar's techniques had been designed to achieve. Not fear of actual weapons, but uncertainty about the environment itself. Teodoro Baltazar's last major acoustic deception operation occurred on March 8, 1945, during the final Japanese withdrawal from Nueva Ecija province ahead of advancing American forces. Intelligence indicated that a Japanese rear guard, approximately 150 soldiers with machine gun and mortar support, had established defensive positions along the Candaba River, intending to delay American pursuit long enough for main force elements to withdraw northward. The defensive position was formidable: elevated terrain, clear fields of fire, and unprepared fortifications that would require significant American casualties to overcome through direct assault. Captain Valdez, now a major following a field promotion, had been attached to American tactical planning as a liaison officer. When briefed on the Japanese defensive position, he'd made an unusual suggestion to the American battalion commander. "Sir, we have acoustic deception capabilities that might create exploitable confusion in enemy defensive planning." The American commander, Colonel Richard Matthews, had been skeptical but willing to listen. Valdez had brought Baltazar to explain the methodology. Baltazar had laid out a complex operation: position acoustic instruments at multiple locations around the Japanese perimeter, coordinate with actual American artillery to create synchronized real and phantom fire missions, and then use the acoustic confusion to mask the true axis of American assault. "You're proposing we use fake sounds to cover real attacks?" Colonel Matthews had clarified. "Not quite, sir. We're proposing to create multiple apparent threats, forcing the Japanese to distribute defensive attention across their entire perimeter, while your actual assault focuses on their weakest sector. They'll hear artillery preparation fires coming from multiple directions, some real, some simulated, and won't know where the main attack is coming." Matthews had studied the proposal, consulted with his staff, then authorized the operation with significant caveats. "Corporal, if this fails, and my men take unnecessary casualties because we relied on bamboo horns instead of conventional suppressing fire, I will personally see you court-martialed." "All clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." The operation launched at 04:45 hours on March 8th. Baltazar's expanded acoustic team, now 6 operators with 14 instruments, had positioned themselves in a wide arc around the Japanese defensive perimeter. Real American artillery, 105mm howitzers, began firing at 0500 hours, targeting Japanese positions with actual high-explosive rounds. Simultaneously, Baltazar's team triggered their instruments in coordinated sequences designed to suggest artillery fire from completely different directions, north, south, and east of the Japanese positions. The effect was deliberately overwhelming. Real explosions mixed with phantom sounds, creating acoustic chaos that made threat assessment nearly impossible. Japanese defenders, trained to respond to artillery with counter-battery fire and defensive repositioning, found themselves facing apparent threats from every direction simultaneously. Their defensive fire became scattered and unfocused. Machine gun positions fired at grid coordinates where they thought American forces must be staging, hitting empty jungle. Mortar teams expended ammunition suppressing phantom positions. At 05:18 hours, American infantry launched their assault from the west, the direction with minimal acoustic deception, catching Japanese defenders who'd repositioned to counter perceived threats from other directions. The position fell in 43 minutes, with American casualties limited to 7 wounded. Japanese casualties were 62 killed and 45 captured. The remaining defenders fled northward in disorganized retreat. Colonel Matthews personally thanked Baltazar after the operation. "Corporal, and I owe you an apology. I thought this was witch doctor bullshit. Turns out you've weaponized physics in ways our doctrine manuals never considered. Damn fine work." It was the last combat operation Baltazar would conduct. American forces secured Nueva Ecija province within weeks, and the guerrilla war transitioned into mopping up operations and occupation duties. The formal end of World War II in August 1945 found Teodoro Baltazar back in San Jose, helping rebuild his family's farm and attempting to resume something resembling normal life. He had been promoted to sergeant during the final months of the war, received a Philippine Defense Medal, and been personally commended by both American and Filipino commanding officers for his innovative tactical contributions. But there were no parades, no headlines, no dramatic ceremonies. Baltazar was fine with that. He returned to the San Jose Municipal Band in September 1945, resuming his position as third tuba player for fiestas, weddings, and provincial celebrations. Most of his neighbors knew he'd served with the resistance. Few knew the specific nature of his contributions. In 1946, the U.S. Army War College conducted a comprehensive study of guerrilla warfare tactics employed in the Philippines during the occupation. A 3-page action addressed acoustic deception techniques, citing Baltazar's operations as case studies in indigenous tactical innovation under resource constraints. The report concluded, unconventional warfare effectiveness derives not from technological sophistication, but from operators who observe, experiment, and exploit adversary vulnerabilities through creative problem-solving.
And Corporal Funfa.
Later audition. Baltazar's acoustic techniques demonstrate that tactical advantage can be achieved through physics, psychology, and engineering knowledge applied with courage and precision. The report was classified and wouldn't be declassified until 1972. In 1950, a young Filipino army officer named Lieutenant Pedro Sarmiento contacted Baltazar, requesting permission to interview him for a tactical innovations research project. Sarmiento was particularly interested in whether acoustic deception techniques could be adapted for modern warfare contexts. Baltazar had been cautiously supportive. The principles work, but modern warfare has different characteristics. Faster operational tempo, better communications, more sophisticated threat assessment. I don't know if bamboo instruments have relevance against enemies with radar and radios and jet aircraft. But the fundamental concept, exploiting sensory perception to create tactical uncertainty, that remains valid? That remains valid, Baltazar confirmed. Sarmiento's research became a master's thesis at the Philippine Military Academy. Baltazar's techniques were incorporated into unconventional warfare curricula, though usually presented as historical curiosities rather than current tactical doctrine. Over subsequent decades, Baltazar occasionally received visitors, military historians, acoustic researchers, tactical innovation specialists, all wanting to understand how a municipal band member with no formal military education had developed techniques that confused experienced enemy forces and saved countless lives. His answer was always the same. I paid attention, I experimented, and I tried things other people thought were stupid. Sometimes stupid ideas work. In 1983, at age 65, Teodoro Baltazar was invited to speak at the Philippine Military Academy as part of a lecture series on tactical innovation in asymmetric warfare. He told the assembled cadets, young men and women preparing for professional military careers, the story of December 18, 1944, and the months that followed. He emphasized 3 principles. First, observe everything. The most valuable intelligence often comes from noticing things others ignore. Environmental conditions, enemy behavior patterns, physical principles that can be exploited. Second, test your ideas. Theory without experimentation is just speculation. I spent 3 months testing instruments before I ever used them in combat, and that preparation saved my life and achieved mission objectives. Third, accept that you might be wrong. I could have been killed trying acoustic deception. The technique could have failed completely. But I'd done the work, run the tests, and calculated the probabilities. When the mission came, I was ready not because I was confident, but because I was prepared. The lecture concluded with a standing ovation. Military tradition meeting genuine respect. Teodoro Baltazar died in 1994 at age 76, surrounded by family in the same San Jose home where he'd been born. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service briefly, focusing more on his 6 decades with the San Jose Municipal Band and his contributions to local agricultural cooperatives. But among Philippine military historians, acoustic warfare specialists, and unconventional warfare operators, Baltazar's legend continued growing. The acoustic deception techniques he'd pioneered were eventually adapted for modern contexts, using electronic speakers, sophisticated sound engineering, and computer-controlled playback systems to achieve what Baltazar had accomplished with hollow bamboo and creative ingenuity. In 2004, during counterinsurgency operations in Mindanao, Philippine Army Special Forces successfully employed acoustic deception to simulate large force movements, causing insurgent forces to abandon prepared positions without direct engagement. The Operations After Action report cited Baltazar's December 1944 operation as doctrinal precedent. In 2012, the Philippine Army formally designated Baltazar as a tactical innovation pioneer, inducting him posthumously into the Armed Forces of the Philippines Hall of Honor. The induction ceremony included a display of recreated bamboo instruments built according to Baltazar's original specifications, crude, improvised, and brilliantly effective. A plaque accompanying the display reads, "Sergeant Teodoro Baltazar demonstrated that tactical effectiveness derives not from sophisticated weapons, but from creative problem-solving, rigorous observation, and courage to attempt unconventional solutions. His acoustic deception techniques saved lives, delayed enemy operations, and proved that intelligence and ingenuity can overcome material disadvantage." But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from a former Japanese soldier, Corporal Hiroshi Tano, and who'd been part of the December 18th reconnaissance element that Baltazar's instruments had stalled. In a 1985 interview with the Philippine-Japanese Friendship Society, Tanaka recalled, "We thought we faced American artillery. We prepared for conventional battle. Instead, we fought ghosts, sounds that seemed real, but came from everywhere and nowhere. I was terrified not because of weapons I could see, but because I could trust nothing I heard." That Filipino soldier, whoever he was, understood something about war that our generals never taught us. Fear comes from uncertainty, not just from firepower. Tanaka never learned Baltazar's name, but his description perfectly captured what the supply clerk from San Jose had accomplished. Teodoro Baltazar had weaponized doubt. He had transformed physical principles into tactical advantages, and he had proven that the most effective weapon is sometimes not a weapon at all, but understanding, creativity, and the courage to attempt what others dismiss as impossible. Today, in the mountains of Nueva Ecija province, old farmers occasionally tell stories about the war, about Japanese occupation, American liberation, and the Filipino guerrillas who fought between. Some stories are about battles, some about heroism, some about survival, and some are about a man with a bamboo tuba who made an entire Japanese battalion believe they were surrounded by artillery that didn't exist. The stories are embellished, exaggerated, and fundamentally true, because Teodoro Baltazar did exactly what the stories claim. He turned sound into a weapon, confusion into victory, and creativity into tactical advantage. And no one who served with him ever doubted his methods again. And his legend endures, not because he performed impossible feats, but because he proved that observation, experimentation, and courage could overcome every material disadvantage. The bamboo tuba couldn't kill, but the sound struck fear. And fear, properly weaponized, was more powerful than any bullet.